So what I worked on for these last 2 days was making a top piece to match the skirt for Samantha's tinfoil UFO dress for the sci-fi convention scene. Um, and so to do this, on Thursday I started um, looking at making a pattern piece to get the shape for the top part. To do this, I used a similar process as with the skirt, where I cut the shape that I was thinking of out of paper first, just to check that it would behave how I was expecting before cutting anything out unnecessarily and not wasting any material. And um, I found that I was happy with the shape pretty much straight away. I did fold the paper a few times to get it just right and make some minute changes. And once I'd done that, I put it onto the material and I traced around the shape with a pen because the material is so slippy and it isn't fabric, so it isn't woven. It is like um, plastic, maybe. I'm not quite sure. But if you puncture it, that puncture mark will stay, so I can't pin the pattern piece onto the material like I usually would do if I was sewing something. So I found tracing it was quite a good alternative because when you're just holding it there, because the top's quite slippy, and it will slide around as you're trying to cut it, and it will make the shape change or make it harder to make the shape that is on the pattern piece because it will have moved. So I cut it out, and once I cut it out, I decided that actually it was a little bit large, um, and that I wanted maybe a bit more structure in it, a bit more interest because it was just a flat piece, and I thought maybe I'd try making it rounder by cutting the piece into panels. So cutting once down the middle and twice on the sides, um, to and then sewing those panels together, um, kind of like darts, where I would start with a smaller, with a bigger gap at the top and go down along the edge of the seam, so it gave it a bit of a lift in the same way as with the skirt, so that each piece is wider at the bottom and smaller at the top, so it gives it that kind of lift. And then I also top stitched over each of the seams of the panels just to make it a bit flatter because otherwise it's very clearly in curved shapes like that, and I didn't really like that. I feel it looks a bit weird. It's not quite what I'm after. I might think about using that effect in some of the other costumes, but for this one, because it's a UFO, I want it to be a lot rounder, um, which was what I was after. So I top stitched, which made the seams flatter. Uh, because I was sewing the sides, it gave it that flatter shape. So I tried that on one of the people around me just to check that it sat properly on a human body. And then I made a back piece in much the same way, except with the front piece, I added a strip the same way I did on the bottom of the skirt, just to give it a bit more of that lift and make it a bit flatter overall, so there wasn't that wobbly effect that can happen when sewing panels of this material together. I then thought about attaching the front and the back piece. I taped it initially in the places just to see how it would sit, um, and I was quite happy with it. So then I got some pieces of elastic and sewed two on each side of the body and two at the shoulders. And I then tried that on someone, and I found that it was quite difficult to get on and off. The head was quite small, particularly with the getting the arms in and out. That was quite difficult. So then I knew that I needed to make some kind of opening, some fastening somewhere on it to make the getting in and out easier because um, the actor's gonna probably need to get in and out of that fairly swiftly because it will be a change from her usual costume and she will change out of it. And for ease and longevity of the costume, it would be better to have it more easily accessible to get on and off, and there's less chance of it breaking if that is a thing as well. I didn't have time to finish that on Thursday, so I started it on Friday. I added poppers to the elastic and some one half to the top and one half to the elastic so it could pop on and off on one side. And this worked very well. But the head hole is still a bit small, so when I come back in next week, I will need to do something about that. I might scratch having it on the elastic, having the poppers on the elastic, sew the elastic to it, and just cut a strip down the back, which can open and shut, because then I don't need to think about finding some way to get around the sleeves to get the poppers on. The sleeves were what I mostly worked on today. I cut out a semicircle um, of reasonable length and uh, two of the same semicircle, and I attached that to the top of the top, and I found that the shape was quite higher than I wanted, so I added two little pleats on each one to just give it a bit more of a softer shape because it was quite a sharp straight up because the material is so stiff. Um, and I also had to hand sew those pleats because I was unable to fit it in the machine with the amount of shape that it had to it. That was quite difficult. Getting some of the other seams done as well because it just wouldn't fit inside the machine. There was no way of contorting it or twisting it to get it in there to sew. And also, if I twisted it around too much, it could lose some of its structure, which I found that with the skirt a little bit when I was sewing it, that because I was having to bring it round and fold it to actually get it through the machine, that at some places it doesn't stick out quite as much as it would have if I hadn't had to fold it like that. So I wanted to avoid that where possible, and particularly with the pleats, they don't need to be as strong as some of the other parts that have stitching, so it was more okay to hand stitch that. And then I was working on just adding decoration to the sleeves, and I wanted it to look quite homemade and like cobbled together from things that she'd probably have lying around the house because that's what this costume is. So I used tin foil and mini pie dishes and paper cups, silvery paper cups, to just um, dress it. I layered the cups to give that kind of, in a lot of futuristic costumes that I have looked at, they have a lot of layers, sort of robot-y metal kinds of thing. And I added some like mesh fabric just for a bit more interest in parts that were looking quite blank. I also added some of that to the front. What I want to do is maybe cut out some more stars out of cardboard with foil tape over the top, like I did for the skirt, and add that to both the top and the skirt. I also, with the aluminium foil, I pleated a lot of it to try and give it a bit of shape and a bit more interest. And I laid this on a few of them and made it a bit of a theme. The sleeves are asymmetrical because I thought it was a bit more interesting that way, and also she'd probably not have a lot of like the same materials to hand, so it felt more likely that she'd have just whatever she could find, so she wouldn't have a lot of the same thing, which also I don't because of it's just bits and pieces um from wherever, like very much home sourced. Um, I then tried it on someone again just to see how it was looking, how the shape was on an actual body. Um, and I think there's quite a lot of gapping in the back because it has got that circular shape which I was after, but not so much in the front, just in the back, which I think maybe looks a bit odd, which also gives me more reason, I think, to perhaps try cutting the back and putting the poppers there. So I think that's really the first thing that I'll think about getting done when I come in on Monday before moving on to the next and final part of the costume.